Hello and welcome to my guide for painting 3 of the heroes from Blackstone Fortress. As you can see, the very first thing I've done is sprayed them all with some matte white spray from Colourforge. Then starting with the Navigator, I used some Cantor blue on the inside of his cloak. This was then given a wash with some Drakenhof Nightshade. For the priest, I used some Wraithbone to paint his robe. This was then washed with some Army Painter Soft Tone, which had been thinned down with some Lamia Medium. For the robot, I then used some Arithmetic Blue, thinned down with some Contrast Medium. And this was an all-over body wash. Once the washes have dried, I'm then going to go ahead and do a 50-50 mix of Cantor Blue and Atolok Blue to start highlighting the Navigator's robe. This will be followed by Atolok Blue just by itself. With the inside of the robe out of the way, I'm going to work on the outside. So for that, I'm going to use some Nagaroth Night. And this will be followed by a wash of Druchii Violet. While that dries, I'm going to move on to the priest, and I'm going to relayer the Wraithbone just to neaten things up a little bit, but I'm going to avoid all of the recesses because I want to keep that shading. This will be followed by a 50-50 mix of Wraithbone and matte white for the first set of highlights. And then matte white just by itself for the second. I'm then going to use Corn Red to paint sort of the inside of the tassels that are coming from his robe. And I'm also going to use that to paint the tops of the Purity Seals. Those areas will receive a wash with some Carroburg Crimson. I'm then going to give the robot another coat with the Arithmetic Blue thinned down with the contrast paint because I want that colour to be a little bit deeper. Once the wash has dried on the Navigator, I'm then going to go back and I'm going to use a 50-50 mix of Nagaroth Night and Zerus Purple for the first highlight. This will be followed by Zerus Purple for the second. And then for the final highlight, it'll be a 50-50 mix of Zerus Purple and matte white. For the Corn Red, I'm just going to quickly relayer the Corn Red just to brighten it up ever so slightly. And then I'm going to use some Wazdakka Red. For additional parts on the robe, including the bit down the centre and the ends on the sleeves, I'm going to use some Mephiston Red. And this will then get washed with some Carroburg Crimson. While that wash dries, I'm going to mix a tiny little bit of matte white to the Arithmetic Blue, and then I'm going to dry brush that onto the robot. This will be followed by another dry brush of just matte white, but it'll be a much lighter dry brush as I only really want to capture all the sort of very tips and finer points. I'm then going to use Mephiston Red to paint the centre light on the robot. And then I'm going to do a 50-50 mix of Mephiston Red and Evil Sunz Scarlet to start highlighting the red on the priest. And I'll also use it to highlight the lights on the robot. And this will be followed by me not paying any attention to where the camera is and highlighting the red with some Evil Sunz Scarlet. I'm then going to use some Bugman's Glow to paint the skin of the priest. And that'll get a wash with some Reichland Flesh Shade. I'm then going to paint the book on his back, his belt, his holster and his pouch with Dryad Bark. I'm also going to paint his boots, and I'm also going to paint the Navigator's holster as well. For any paper that's dotted around the miniatures, I'm going to use some Rakarth Flesh. Next, I'm going to paint the book that the priest is holding, or the back of it at least, with some Rhinox Hide. The Servo Skull with some Morghast Bone. And then it'll all be washed with some Agrax Earthshade. While that wash dries, I'm then going to paint the skin with a 50-50 mix of Bugman's Glow and Cadian Flesh Tone. This is then followed by Cadian Flesh Tone just by itself. And then a 50-50 mix of Cadian Flesh Tone and Kislev Flesh. And for the final highlight, it'll just be Kislev flesh just by itself. I'm then going to paint the eye sockets and the inside of the mouth with some Abaddon black. Then I'll paint the eyes with some matte white. And then finally, add some pupils with some more Abaddon black. Then I'm going to use a little bit more matte white to paint in some teeth. Moving back to the Dryad bark, which the wash should have dried, I'm going to use a 50-50 mix of Dryad bark and Gothor brown for the first highlight, followed by Gothor brown just by itself for the second. I'll highlight the Rhinox hide with some Catachan flesh. And for the paper, I'm going to relayer the Rakarth flesh, avoiding any of the recesses. And this will be followed by a 50-50 mix of Rakarth flesh and Pallid Witch flesh. And then finally, Pallid Witch flesh just by itself. Next, I'm going to move on to the Servo skull, and I'm going to relayer the Morghast bone, avoiding any of the recesses. Followed by a 50-50 mix of Morghast bone and Wraithbone. And then a final highlight of Wraithbone just by itself. I'm going to paint the rosary beads and the pages of the book with some grey seer. And I'm also going to paint the little skull on the back of the navigator's robe. I'll then use a 50-50 mix of grey seer and matte white for the first highlight. And then matte white just by itself for the second and final highlight. Continuing with the robe, I'm going to use some Mephiston red to paint the circle. And this will be followed by a 50-50 mix of matte white and Mephiston red for the highlight. I'm then going to use some Deathworld forest to paint the leaves. And I'll give those a wash with some Athonian camo shade. On the priest, there's a big glowy thing in his chest, so I'm going to use some Arkellian green for that. And then I'm going to start painting all the silver detail with some Iron Hand steel. I'm then going to paint any tubes or piping with some Skavenblight dinge. And then on the priest's hat and in the book are a couple of Inquisitor symbols, and I'm going to paint those with the Fang. Then all those areas we've just painted, starting from the Iron Hand steel, will receive a wash with some Nuln oil. After that, I nudge my camera out of the way so you can't see what I'm doing, and then I use Storm Vermin Fur to highlight all of the tubes and pipes. I then relayered the Fang on the Inquisitorial symbol just to brighten things up slightly. And then used a 50-50 mix of the Fang and matte white to give it a highlight. I then highlight the gem in the centre of the priest with some Barahoth blue. Next, I used a 50-50 mix of Iron Hand steel and Stormhost silver to highlight all of the metal. And then I used some Stormhost silver to highlight all of the edges and the tips of the silver. For the navigator's boots, I used some Abaddon black. And for his sleeves, I used some Mechanicus standard grey. These were then washed with some Nuln oil. Next, I used some Retributor armor to paint all of the gold sections on everything. That's pretty much all of the trim on the priest, the navigator's helmet, and there's a tiny little badge on the robot. This was then given a wash with some Reichland flesh shade. When that wash dries, I'm going to use some Screamer Pink to paint the bookmarks on the book that the priest is holding. And then I'm going to use some Warp Block Bronze to paint the front section of the priest's weapon. These areas were then given a quick wash with some Agrax Earthshade. I then highlighted the gold with a 50-50 mix of Uruk Armor Gold and Retributor Armor. Then for a second highlight, just Uruk Armor Gold. The Screamer Pink was then highlighted with a 50-50 mix of Screamer Pink and Matte White. For the robot, the navigator, and the servo skull, I used some Mephiston red to start painting their lenses. This was then followed by a 50-50 mix of Mephiston red and Evil Sun scarlet. Then Evil Sun Scarlet just by itself. And this was followed by a little bit of Wild Rider Red. I'm then going to use some Fire Dragon Bright to paint the center of the inquisitorial symbol on the book, in the book, and a couple of lights on the robot. I'll then add a tiny bit of white to the mix for a 50-50 ratio for the highlight. There's a gem in the center of the forehead of the Navigator, and I'm going to use some Barahoth Blue. This will be followed by a 50-50 mix of Barahoth Blue and Matte White. And then finally, I'm going to use Matte White to place a small dot in the center of all the lights. Lastly, for the Navigator, I'm going to paint his ball that's at the tip of his cane with some grey cere. And this will be followed by some matte white. Once you've based them in your chosen manner, that's those guys finished. I have to say, they're a lot of fun to paint, and there's lots of lovely detailing on there, and well, it's always a blast to paint Imperial stuff. I think they do a very good job with the way these guys look. In total, they took around about 6.5 hours to complete for all 3 of them, and once again, as I said, that was an absolute blast painting them. If you enjoyed this video and you found it useful, please think about giving the channel a subscribe, the video a thumbs up, and I will see you on the next one. Thank you so much for watching, and goodbye for now.